People who have ADHD tend to be drawn to entrepreneurship and are much more open to risk-taking than the general population. But are we actually any good at entrepreneurship? Let's find out. Hello and welcome to Through the Noise Coaching. My name is Lee and I'm a leadership coach specialised in growing the careers of mid to senior neurospices. I'm also an ADHD entrepreneur myself, so this question is of particular interest to me to find out the answer. So I really hope the answer is not no. And spoiler, it's not no, because I probably wouldn't be making this video otherwise. But the answer isn't super straightforward, so let's get into exploring the topic a little bit further. Last week I did a video on ADHD and our interest in becoming entrepreneurs and looked at some of the most recent academic research which found that people with ADHD are almost twice as likely to want to start a business as the general population. If you haven't seen that video already, I'd recommend going back and watching it because it lays some of the groundwork of today's video. I have 3 papers that I want to look at today from the past 6 years. All of them tackle this question from a slightly different angle. But before we actually get into it, there's an important distinction that I need to make here. And that's the difference between looking at ADHD diagnosis and ADHD symptoms or ADHD-like behaviour, because some of the papers look entirely at diagnose and some of them look at ADHD-like behaviour. So it's important to explore a little bit around this topic. The first paper that I want to look at today actually explains why this happens pretty well, so we're going to start there. The paper itself is called ADHD Symptoms, Entrepreneurial Orientation and Firm Performance, and it recognises that many people who would qualify for a diagnosis just don't get one. I mean, the standards of accessibility and availability of diagnoses in different countries varies enormously. So it can be really hard to get a clear picture of who does and doesn't have ADHD based on diagnosis criteria. It can also vary according to socioeconomic status as well, so it can be really hard to get a clear picture of who actually does and doesn't have ADHD based on yes-no diagnoses. They even argue that a yes-no diagnosis might not actually be helpful because ADHD symptoms exist along a continuum. It's not like, yes, it's this, or no, it's something completely different. And that's why we have diagnostic processes where we have actual assessors who interview us and talk to us about our experience instead of just say yes, no, tick box, here's your ADHD certificate, or no, you don't have ADHD. It's more complex than that, and so by looking at ADHD symptoms, they argue that they can potentially capture more about the ADHD condition rather than diagnoses alone. Finally, they point out that many people who are diagnosed with ADHD either medicate or have other treatments that mean that their ADHD symptoms are potentially a little bit less severe than they were before they started medicating or treating it. And this could affect the results as well. So while the debate rages on around official diagnosis, self-diagnosis and all that kind of stuff, I'm happy to put that to a side right now and move on talking about the research that's actually there, which is mostly based around ADHD symptoms rather than ADHD diagnosis, and in fact that's where we're going to start with the first paper. This paper focuses on entrepreneurial orientation, which is something that has been found across multiple studies to have a positive impact on entrepreneurial performance across many different countries and industries. The paper actually refers to it as the most researched concept in the whole of entrepreneurship, so it sounds like the theory behind it is quite robust. While entrepreneurial orientation might sound like what we discussed last week around a person's interest in becoming an entrepreneur, that is actually defined dimensions of it, and we can relate these to the ADHD symptoms, which is what we're going to go ahead and do. There are 3 dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation: innovativeness, proactiveness, and risk-taking, all of which interlink with each other. Innovative reflects an openness to new ideas and exploring new concepts, whereas proactiveness suggests an idea of moving fast to take that first mover advantage and to actually get things done. Risk-taking is all about being able to take action under uncertainty or when the situation is a little bit more risky. And that is the opening gambit of every single ADHD and entrepreneurial paper that I've read. They all say, ADHDers make good entrepreneurs because they are more likely to take risks, and you need to take risks to be an entrepreneur. That's a very simplified response, so we're going to go much deeper than that today. Specifically, the paper states, innovation generates opportunities for extra economic rents compared to competitors. Proactiveness provides first mover opportunity, enabling the firm to occupy market space and charge premium prices, and risk-taking may cause high performance variance, but it leads to performance advantage in the longer term. So as many academic papers do, we can look at these 3 aspects against the 3 different traits of ADHD: inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactiveness, and look at the relationship between the 2. Starting with inattention. They recognise that inattention may increase creativity and innovation by divergent thinking, coming up with new ideas that others might not have thought about. However, inattentiveness does have its drawback because it might make it much more difficult to be proactive and use convergent thinking to take an idea from initial ideation phase to something that is actually implementable and moving forwards. In contrast, hyperactivity/impulsivity symptoms tend to be correlated with risk taking, which inattention isn't, and also tend to lead to speedy decision making, something that inattention tends to slow down. In fact, inattention hasn't actually been found to correlate with entrepreneurial orientation or people starting businesses at all. So it's kind of not the best place to look right now. We'll leave inattention to the side right now, as it just seems to have no real impact either way. When we turn to hyperactivity instead, this seems to be characterized by quick action, maybe without thinking, and novelty seeking, and well, we just get bored pretty easily. The fact that we get bored pretty easily can be seen in challenging tasks where we can enjoy and engage with the hard part. Once a challenge is done and it becomes easy, it becomes boring or monotonous or repetitiveness, and we lose interest in it. Our sensation seeking is related to openness to new experience and change, and our hyperactivity/impulsivity also makes us alert. This alertness makes us more responsive, and so the paper suggests that we are future and opportunity oriented. Hyperactivity/impulsivity is also related to delay aversion, which can cause us to move towards stimulating, intrinsically interesting and novel tasks being performed in a busy and fast-paced environment. Something that came up in all three papers actually is that we tend to be more sensitive to the upside potential when talking about risky actions. So we're more attracted to the potential good, and we're less sensitive to the potential downside. In fact, here's a quote for you. Adults with ADHD have similar intellectual capacity as non-ADHD individuals, but are more attracted by rewards and are willing to bear potential losses for the sake of pleasure. This could be interpreted as us finding risky situations much more attractive, and so makes us more likely to pursue them. When we look at these traits that I just described, we can see that they can actually be mapped onto the entrepreneurial orientation traits of proactiveness, innovativeness, and risk-taking, and thus, while inattentiveness might not really correlate with entrepreneurial action, it seems that ADHD, impulsivity/hyperactivity does correlate with entrepreneurial orientation, and entrepreneurial orientation correlates with success in entrepreneurship. So therefore, this suggests that ADHD symptoms related to impulsivity and hyperactivity may well correlate with entrepreneurial success. The concept of ADHD traits being sometimes helpful, sometimes not, is the premise of the paper. Dueling Banjos, Harmony and Discord Between ADHD and Entrepreneurship. And this is the one we're going to take a look at next. The premise behind this paper is that ADHD traits are two sides of the same coin. So a particular trait could be positive in some contexts and negative in other contexts. So when we talk about the discussion around ADHD and entrepreneurship, we really need to dive a little further into the context to find whether a trait is helpful or hindrance in that particular example. We spoke last week about the concept of person-environment fit, and if the person is in an environment that doesn't fit for them, they're going to struggle to perform a lot compared to if they're in an environment that does work for them. This paper argues that the person-environment fit should be looked at deeper in different stages of the entrepreneurial life cycle. Instead of just assuming entrepreneurship is a singular type of environment, we should look at each stage of entrepreneurship and the person-environment fit within that stage. For example, we can take a look at the founder problem, which has nothing to do with ADHD, and says that the founders tend to be replaced by new leaders as a company grows and scales, because the person that took the business from the very beginning up until a certain point in its development might not be the right person to take the company to the next stage in its life. The paper talks about initiation style behaviours versus structuring style behaviours, and suggests that initiating style behaviours tend to be better suited towards ADHD, which might suggest that founding as a stage might be something that ADHDers are really suited to, and then the growing stage later on might be something that's more difficult because it's more structuring based. But that is actually an oversimplification, and there's initiation and structuring like behaviours in all different stages of the entrepreneurial life cycle. This paper considers 6 stages, and we're going to look at them one by one, starting with interest and opportunity identification as the first one. Immediately, one important thing it highlights is entrepreneurial interest, because without interest, then attention, motivation can go elsewhere. But as we established last week, those of us with ADHD tend to actually be quite interested in entrepreneurship, so I think we can consider this one a win and move on. In order to move forward with new ideas, we need out-of-the-box thinking, we need creativity, which is something that ADHD brains are known for. However, this can also be a disadvantage, because if we ideate across too many ideas, we might find our attention is spread too thinly, and we might not do the research into competitors or the market necessary to take a single idea forwards. For stage 2, nascent stage entrepreneurship, they found that people with ADHD tended to act upon entrepreneurial ideas much more quickly and bring more ideas to the foreground than people who didn't have ADHD. They also found us more likely to be seen as visionaries and to have the ability to inspire others to jump on board with us and come on the journey with us. However, because our ideas tend to be more novel, they're also more risky and therefore more likely to fail. So we fail much more often, even though we come up with many more ideas. One could argue that it doesn't matter how many fail as long as you launch one that is a big success. So potentially that's not actually a bad thing. For the resource acquisition stage, the benefits and drawbacks of ADHD tend to be a lot more, it depends on the context kind of situation. ADHD tends to be great for things like bringing people on board, but struggles a lot more with like the boring administrative tasks that just don't take our attention very well. Entrepreneurship is also a game of social relationships, and so some of the things that make the social side of ADHD a bit more difficult can definitely affect us here. I actually really like what the paper says here. It highlights that we're not incapable of doing administrative tasks, they're just harder, but we can do them. We can do hard things. They're just a bit harder, we just might need a bit more help and support. And actually we're more likely to push past naysayers or break through barriers, which makes it more likely that we're going to get people investing to us, especially for things like fundraising. Next, I look at resource coordination and found out actually that's probably a weak part for ADHD. It's things like setting out policies or procedures or formal processes that we probably just don't find very interesting. However, the lack of structure that we tend to have with ADHD could also mean innovation in this space and mean we get less bogged down in those regulations, so it doesn't have to be a bad thing. For venture capital, again, we hit the it depends world. You know, for certain markets, there needs to be a lot of research on timing of entering the market, current market state, that require much more of a structuring approach. But for markets that are much more uncertain, much newer, then the less structured approach, more initiating approach of ADHD could be much more beneficial. Finally, when talking about innovation and renewal, again, ADHD depends on the context. In businesses that need much more stability, ADHD might be a drawback, but we're amazing at innovation. So in a business where innovation helps the business grow, then ADHD is a real asset here. The paper concludes that the same ADHD traits can be a benefit or a deficit depending on the situation in the particular stages of entrepreneurship and the person environment fit there and the context that they are found in. The environment changes over time, and so an ADHD might need to bring in different kind of supports at different times according to the person environment fit they find themselves in. So we have on the one hand that ADHD traits can lead to entrepreneurial success through entrepreneurial orientation. But on the other hand, ADHD traits can either be adaptive or maladaptive to the business environment, depending on what stage of the business life cycle that we're in, and also the unique circumstances that are there. So it seems like ADHD traits in isolation aren't enough to definitively answer the question about whether ADHDers are successful at entrepreneurship. But what if we paired it with passion? That was such a clickbaity way to phrase things, but it does actually lead me on to the topic of next week, which is going to be if we look at ADHD traits and passion for different aspects of entrepreneurship, what is the magic combination that makes entrepreneurial success much more likely? I'll be back with that video for next week. In the meantime, hit like, comment, hit subscribe, and if you haven't seen it already, you might be interested in watching my previous video on how ADHD evolved. Thank you for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.